There is a moment, brief, ugly, unremarkable to everyone watching, when a man decides what a woman is worth based entirely on how she looks standing in front of him. He does not ask questions. He does not hesitate. He just decides. In a crowded military corridor on a base that smelled like floor wax and old coffee, a Marine made that calculation in under 3 seconds. The woman in civilian clothes was in his way. She was not moving fast enough. She was not saluting. She was not, in his estimation, anyone worth slowing down for. So he shoved her, shoulder first, hard, the kind of shove that has a message tucked inside it. Move, woman, this is not your world. She hit the wall. Her folders scattered. A few people looked. Most did not. The Marine kept walking. He did not look back. Why would he? She was nobody. A visitor, maybe. A contractor. Some civilian who wandered onto the wrong floor and needed reminding of where she stood in the order of things. He was still thinking that, or not thinking at all, because men like that rarely think past the moment of impact. When the base commander's assistant appeared at his elbow 40 minutes later and told him he needed to report immediately. Not tomorrow. Not after chow. Now. The Marine walked into that office with his chest out and his jaw set. She was already sitting at the head of the table. The woman from the hallway. Rear Admiral Christine Engel, 26 years of service, 2 combat deployments, the officer who had overseen the most sensitive SEAL operations of the last decade, looked at him the way you look at something small that has made itself briefly inconvenient. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. This is the story of what happened before that room, inside it, and long after the door closed. It is not a story about revenge, though some people will read it that way. It is not a story about a woman proving herself, though she did that too, proved it so many times over so many years that the proving itself became its own kind of burden. It is a story about what it costs to be invisible by choice in a world that mistakes your invisibility for weakness. And what happens when the cost finally comes due. Christine Engel did not grow up dreaming about the Navy. That is the first thing people get wrong when they try to tell her story. They want the origin to be cinematic. A girl standing on a dock watching ships disappear into fog, something swelling her chest, a destiny clicking into place like a bolt on a rifle. They want the story to begin with certainty because certainty is easier to follow. Certainty makes a clean line from beginning to end and lets the audience feel the satisfaction of a life that always knew where it was going. Christine's life was not that kind of line. She grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is the kind of town that teaches you 2 things very young: how to be polite to people who do not deserve it, and how to carry something heavy without letting your face show the weight. Her father was a civil engineer who read history books at the dinner table and believed that understanding how things collapsed was more important than understanding how they were built. Her mother taught 6th grade math and had a habit of framing every problem, household, personal, professional, as an equation. Find the unknown. Show your work. Check the answer. Christine was the middle child of 3. Her older brother Marcus was the kind of boy who ran toward fire, not because he was brave, but because he was incapable of imagining that the fire would ever actually touch him. Her younger sister Dana was quiet in the way still water is quiet. You only understood the depth when something fell in. Christine was neither of those things. She was observant in a way that made adults uncomfortable, because she was not observant in the way that earns compliments. She was observant in the way that earns suspicion. She noticed what people did not say. She noticed where they looked when they thought no one was watching. She noticed who sat at the head of the table and who arranged the chairs. She was 8 years old when she first asked her father why there were no women in the photographs that lined his office wall. He had 6 framed photographs, military men, all of them from different eras, different branches. He had been in the Army himself, briefly, before a knee injury sent him back to civilian life with a limp and a carefully maintained silence about what that transition had cost him. He thought about her question for a long moment. Then he said, because they were not allowed in the room where those photographs were taken. She asked why. He said, because the people who decided who was allowed in the room were the people already in it. She was 8. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she filed it away in the place where she kept things that mattered before she knew why they mattered, and she did not stop thinking about it for the next 23 years. She was not a military child in the traditional sense. Her father's service had been brief, and his feelings about it were complicated. He did not romanticize uniforms. He had not put a flag in the yard on holidays. He taught his children that institutions were only as good as the people inside them, and that the people inside them were only as good as who they chose to be when the institution was not watching. That lesson would come back to Christine in a hallway on a naval base in Virginia on a Wednesday morning in March, when a man in uniform decided she was not worth slowing down for. But that is getting ahead of things. She was 17 when a Navy recruiter came to her high school and stood in the gymnasium in his dress whites and spoke for 45 minutes about service and sacrifice and the future. Most of her classmates were half asleep. Christine sat in the fourth row and did not move for the entire presentation. Not because she was entranced by the speech. The speech was generic, the kind of thing that had been given in that gymnasium 100 times before, but because she was watching something else entirely. She was watching the recruiter's hands when he talked about leadership. She was watching which parts of the room he made eye contact with, and which parts he looked over. She was watching who he spoke to after, when the formal presentation ended, and the gymnasium became a loose scattering of teenagers pretending to have questions. He spoke to the boys. Every single one of his post-presentation conversations was with a boy. He shook their hands. He leaned in. He gave them pamphlets with his card tucked inside. He walked past Christine twice. The second time, she stepped directly into his path and held out her hand. He shook it with the automatic politeness of a man who has been taught to be polite to everyone while meaning it for almost no one. She asked him 3 questions about officer training programs. He answered all 3 in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by engaging with the premise at all. She thanked him. She went home. She did the research herself. She applied to the United States Naval Academy the following year and was accepted. Her mother cried. Her father looked at her for a long moment over the kitchen table and then nodded in a way that was worth more than most people's standing ovations. Her brother Marcus said she was going to get herself killed. Her sister Dana said nothing, just reached across the table and squeezed her hand once, and Christine understood that this was its own kind of language. Annapolis was not what she expected. This surprises people when she says it, because people expect her to say it was harder than she expected, or colder, or more political. It was all of those things, but the unexpected part was subtler. The unexpected part was how much of the institution's energy was devoted to sorting people, constantly, obsessively along lines that were sometimes visible and sometimes not, and how much of surviving it depended on understanding which lines were real and which ones were performed. She learned to read runes the way her mother had taught her to read equations. Find the unknown. Show your work. She was not the only woman in her class, but she was one of the few women in her class who decided early on that she was not going to spend any energy trying to be liked by people whose opinion of her was already decided. This was not arrogance. It was economics. She had a fixed amount of energy. She could spend it on performance, on softening edges, and laughing at the right moments, and making men comfortable with her presence, or she could spend it on becoming so technically excellent that her presence became impossible to argue with. She chose the second thing. This did not make her popular. It made her, depending on who you asked, difficult, cold, intimidating, aggressive, or some combination of all 4. She collected these adjectives the way some people collect grievances, cataloged them, noted the pattern in them, and used the pattern as a compass pointing toward exactly the right direction. Her first assignment after commissioning was a destroyer out of Norfolk. She was 22 years old, and she was the only female officer in her department. Her department head was a lieutenant commander named Garrett Walsh, who believed in hierarchy with the religious conviction of someone who has never had to question what the hierarchy did for him. He was not cruel. He was something harder to fight than cruel. He was fair in the way a system is fair when the system was built by people who looked like him. He applied the rules consistently. The rules just happened to compress her into a smaller space than everyone else. She worked inside that space with a precision that eventually became its own argument. There is a version of excellence that forces even unwilling witnesses to acknowledge what they are seeing. Christine found that version and lived inside it for 3 years until Walsh rotated out and was replaced by a commander who looked at her record and said, in the flat, direct tone of someone stating an observable fact, "You should have been recommended for advancement 6 months ago." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I'm recommending you now." She said, "Thank you, sir." She did not say what she was thinking, which was that the 6 months she had waited, the 6 months she had waited while men with thinner records moved past her, were not just months. They were the compound interest of a decision she had made at 17 to walk into a room where she was not expected and stay there until her presence became a fact that no one could administratively revise. By 31, she had 2 deployments, a reputation that preceded her into every new assignment, and a phone call from a program she is not allowed to name in public asking whether she was interested in working on the coordination layer of a certain special operations unit's intelligence and logistics framework. She was interested. The next chapter of her career is classified in the specific, technical, legally binding sense of that word. What is not classified is the architecture of it. The fact that for the better part of a decade, Christine Engels sat at the intersection of the most sensitive operations conducted by the United States military's most elite forces, and she sat there not despite the qualities that had made men uncomfortable for 20 years, but because of them. Her ability to read a room was not a soft skill in that context. It was the skill. Her tendency to notice what was not said was not a social liability. It was the job. She does not talk in detail about that period. She talks around it the way you talk around something that is still active and present and has consequences that extend past your own biography. What she will say, when pressed, is that working with special operations forces restructured something in her understanding of what human beings are capable of in both directions. She saw people do things that had no adequate civilian language. She saw people hold themselves together under conditions that should have dissolved them. She also saw the other thing, the cost of it, the thing that gets paid years later in quiet rooms that are not on any official record. She rose. Not dramatically. Not in the way that gets written about in a moment. She rose the way a tide rises steadily, without announcement, until one day someone looks up and the waterline is somewhere it was not before. By the time she walked into that Virginia Naval Base on a March Wednesday, wearing civilian clothes because she was there for a classified briefing that did not advertise itself on the public calendar, she was a rear admiral. She had been a rear admiral for 14 months. She had sat in rooms with heads of state. She had briefed senators. She had signed off on operations that most of the people on that base would never be cleared to know existed. She was carrying a folder and a cup of coffee, and she was thinking about a briefing that was supposed to start in 11 minutes. And she was moving through the corridor at the pace of someone who knows where she's going and why. The Marine was moving the opposite direction. He was tall. He was broad. He was the particular kind of physically imposing that the military produces in young men, and that young men in the military sometimes begin to confuse with a kind of ambient permission, a sense that their body's footprint in a space entitles them to a proportional footprint in every other dimension of that space. He was not looking at her. He was looking at a point approximately 6 feet past her left ear, which is a very specific kind of not looking that has its own communication value. It says, "You're not worth the adjustment." They're going to collide. This was geometrically inevitable. There was space to prevent it. There's almost always space to prevent it, but preventing it required both parties to acknowledge that the other one existed and had equal claim to the corridor. He did not make that acknowledgement. He hit her shoulder first, not accidentally, or not entirely accidentally, because there are collisions that happen because 2 people fail to coordinate, and there are collisions that happen because one person has decided the other one will yield, and this was the second kind. Her folder hit the floor. Her coffee held, which she would later describe, with the dry humor of someone who has survived far worse than this, as a minor miracle. Her back caught the wall. She did not fall completely. She had the core strength and the reflexes of someone who has spent years in environments where falling is not an abstraction, but she hit the wall hard enough to feel it. The Marine kept walking. He did not look back. He did not break stride. He turned the corner at the end of the corridor and was gone. 3 people in the hallway had seen it. One of them, a young female ensign, had taken half a step forward and then stopped, caught in the particular paralysis of someone who witnesses something wrong and cannot immediately calculate the cost of saying so. One of them, a senior enlisted man, was already looking at the floor with the careful attention of someone who has decided this is not his situation. The third was a lieutenant who blinked twice and then resumed walking in the opposite direction. Christine straightened. She picked up her folder. She retrieved the pages that had scattered and put them back in order with the methodical calm of someone running a background process on something else entirely. She was 2 minutes late to her briefing. The men in the room noticed. None of them said anything, because she was the senior officer present, and the room adjusted itself to her arrival the way rooms do when the person who walks in is the one the room has been arranged around. She sat at the head of the table. The briefing ran for an hour and 40 minutes. She asked 11 questions. She made 3 decisions that would take effect within 48 hours. She initialed 4 documents. She did not mention the hallway. She did not need to. She had already, in the 40 minutes between the wall and the room, made exactly 1 phone call. She had not raised her voice in that call. She had not been theatrical about it. She had simply provided a name. She had noted his name tape when she was picking up her folder because Christine Engel notices things, and a location and a time, and asked that the relevant commanding officer be made aware of the incident. She had then finished her coffee, which had survived the whole thing intact. The Marine reported as ordered that afternoon. He walked into the office with his chest out, which is the body language of a man who still believes the situation is the situation he thinks it is. The woman from the hallway was already sitting at the head of the table. There are moments in a person's life that restructure the architecture of their certainty. The moment the Marine understood who he had shoved in that corridor was one of those moments. You could see it. Witnesses would later say, move across his face the way weather moves across flat water. One thing, and then immediately something else, and then a stillness that was not peace, but the closest thing to peace that shock can produce. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, sit down. He sat. What happened in that room belongs to a different part of this story. What matters here, in the first telling, is the corridor, the folder on the floor, the coffee that did not spill, the 3 people who saw it and did the math and came up with different answers about whether it was their business, and the woman who picked up her papers, checked her watch, and went to run her meeting. Because here is what the Marine had not known, could not have known, though ignorance is not the same as innocence, and what the 3 witnesses in the hallway had not known either, that the woman he had shoved in that corridor had spent 26 years teaching herself how to walk through spaces where she was not expected in a way that did not announce itself. Not because she was ashamed of what she was, not because she was hiding, but because she had learned early and at cost that the loudest thing about a person in a room full of people who have already decided what you are is your presence itself. She had learned to let her record walk in first. She had learned to let the room do the work of correcting itself. She had learned that the most devastating thing she could ever do to anyone who underestimated her was simply to remain in the room long enough for the underestimation to become visible. The Marine had given her no special treatment, no particular cruelty. He had done exactly what the training of a certain kind of man in a certain kind of world produces when that training is applied to a woman in civilian clothes in a corridor. He had decided she was not a variable worth calculating. She had, in a very real sense, spent 26 years engineering the conditions that produced his mistake. And she was, in a very specific way, now going to let those 26 years speak for themselves. The folder was back in order. The coffee was still warm. She had a full afternoon of decisions to make that would shape operations she could not name in rooms she could not describe to anyone outside them. The corridor was already behind her. She had never needed it to be in front of her in the first place. The Marine's name was Sergeant First Class Daniel Rourke. He was 29 years old. He had been in the Marine Corps for 9 years. He had 2 deployments behind him, one to Helmand Province, one to a forward operating base in Syria that he was technically not supposed to discuss at parties, though he sometimes did anyway, in the careful, oblique way of someone who wants the credit of the experience without the legal inconvenience of disclosure. He was, by most of the metrics the Corps used to measure such things, a good Marine. His fitness reports were strong. His unit loyalty was unquestioned. He could break down and reassemble a rifle in conditions that would make a civilian cry, and he had done so once while running a low-grade fever in 110-degree heat, and his team leader had told the story enough times that Rourke had stopped needing to tell it himself. He was also a man who had grown up in a world that had consistently confirmed his instinctive read of how rooms were supposed to be ordered. His father had been in the Corps. His uncle had been in the Corps. His high school football coach had been a former Marine who ran practice like a field operation and who had taught his players, through a combination of intention and osmosis, that the first thing you establish in any new space is your position in it. Rourke had internalized this the way you internalize things that are never stated as lessons, not as a belief he held, but as a reflex he had. He did not think about the hierarchy when he moved through it. He moved through it the way water moves through a landscape it has been moving through for years. The channels were already cut. Women in uniform he understood. Women in uniform existed in a category his training had at least nominally prepared him for. They held rank. Rank was the system, and the system was the system. He would not always be happy about it. There were women officers he had served under whose authority sat in his chest like a splinter that would not work itself out. But he would comply with it because compliance with the system was the system, and the system was what stood between civilization and the thing that came after it. Women in civilian clothes in a military corridor at 0930 on a Wednesday were a different category entirely. They were, in the organizational sense, unordered. They had not yet been assigned a place in the hierarchy his nervous system was constantly, unconsciously running. And when you're a man whose nervous system has been running the same hierarchy program for 29 years, an unordered element is processed through the same subroutine as an obstacle. He had not meant to shove her into a wall. This is the part that is simultaneously true and irrelevant. He had not targeted her. He had not felt the specific hot intent of someone who wants to do damage. What he had felt, to the extent that he had felt anything at all in those 3 seconds, was the mildly impatient dismissal of a man who has somewhere to be and has encountered something in his path that does not have the good sense to yield. He had made the adjustment he always made. He had not slowed. He had not deflected. He had applied his body's footprint to the corridor and kept moving. The difference this time, the difference he had not known about, and was going to spend a very long time thinking about, was that the unordered element in his path was Rear Admiral Christine Engel. He found this out 40 minutes after the corridor, when Gunnery Sergeant Price appeared at the door of the briefing room where Rourke was sitting through an infrastructure security update that had already given him a headache, and said, in the tone of a man delivering news that is not good news, "Rourke, you need to come with me." Rourke followed. He was not alarmed yet. Being pulled from a briefing by a gunny was not, in itself, a red flag event. It happened. Administrative things happened. He ran through the last 48 hours quickly and came up with nothing that should have flagged him. His weekend had been unremarkable. His PT scores were current. His administrative paperwork was filed. He had not yet remembered the corridor. It came back to him when they were halfway down the hall toward the base commander's suite, and it came back not as a guilty memory, but as an event that he was now retroactively trying to locate in a relevant context. The woman. He had hit someone in the corridor. He had not looked back. Had someone seen? Had she filed something? He thought. She was in civilian clothes. This is the thought he had. Not I should have been more careful, or that was not the right call. He thought. She was in civilian clothes, which was the thought of a man who had already decided that the category she occupied in his mental file system was the one that made her complaint a bureaucratic inconvenience rather than a substantive problem. He walked into the office with his chest out. She was sitting at the head of the table. There is a particular quality to the moment when a certainty you did not know you were carrying gets removed without warning. It is not dramatic. The dramatic version, the version you see in films, the version with the big musical cue and the slow zoom, is not what it actually looks like. What it actually looks like is smaller than that. It looks like a man walking through a door with his shoulders back and his jaw set, and then something in his face doing a quiet, terrible subtraction, and then the shoulders settling into a different geometry, and then the stillness of a person whose system is trying to reboot on the fly. Rourke saw her and understood in the same moment 3 things: who she was, what he had done, and what the difference between those 2 things now cost him. Rear Admiral. He could read the rank indicators without having to think about it. That was pure reflex, 29 years of training, the one system that did not require a conscious command to run. Rear Admiral. 1 star. And the way the room was arranged around her, the way the 2 men flanking her had the specific posture of people operating in the gravitational field of someone senior, that told him the rest. She said, "Sit down." He sat. He sat the way you sit when the command comes from someone whose authority you're not disputing and cannot dispute and do not have the architecture to dispute, and the sitting itself felt like a different thing than sitting usually felt like something being set down that he had not known he was carrying. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. This was its own kind of pressure, the weight of a silence held by someone who is not filling it, because they do not need to fill it, because the room is already full of what needs to be said. Then, she said, "Tell me what happened in the corridor this morning." Rourke said, "Ma'am, and then he stopped because the sentence he had been about to produce, the sentence he had been constructing since Price appeared at the door of the briefing room, was the wrong sentence, and some part of him knew it was the wrong sentence even as he was starting to say it. The sentence was a sentence about civilian clothes and not seeing and the pace of the morning, and it was the kind of sentence that moved responsibility around without addressing it. And he looked at her face and understood that this was not a room where that sentence was going to do anything useful. He said, "I was moving through the corridor. I didn't, another stop. I should have looked where I was going, ma'am." She said, "That's one way to describe it." The flatness of it was more effective than volume would have been. It had the quality of a closed door, not slammed, just shut, with the finality of something that is finished being a question. She said, "You have 9 years of service. You've deployed twice. You know how a corridor works." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "So the issue is not that you didn't know how a corridor works." He said nothing. She said, "The issue is that you looked at me and made a decision. And I want you to sit here for a minute and be honest with yourself about what that decision was." The room was very quiet. The two men flanking her were looking at the table with the careful attention of people who understand that their job right now is to be furniture. Rourke sat with the question she had put in front of him. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built his self-concept on a set of structures that had been consistently reinforced, and he was sitting in a room where those structures were being asked to answer for themselves in front of someone they had failed to account for, and the asking was very quiet and very direct and had nowhere to hide from. He said, "I saw someone I didn't recognize." And I didn't. He stopped again. "I didn't make room." She said, "You made an assumption." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "And you acted on it." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "And now we're here." There was a pause. Then she said something that was not what he had expected. He had expected the administrative consequence, the formal reprimand, the notation in his record, the thing that would follow him through the remainder of his career, the way certain events follow people through careers. He had been calculating this since the moment he recognized her rank, running the math of what a formal complaint from a rear admiral did to the trajectory of a sergeant first class's next evaluation cycle. She said, "I've spent 26 years in rooms where people looked at me and made assumptions. That's not a complaint. It's a fact. And the fact is that the assumptions are trained. They're in the system. They come from somewhere." She looked at him. "You came from somewhere, too." He said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She said, "What I want from you is not an apology. I don't need your apology. What I want from you is a question. I want you to go back to your unit and sit with this and ask yourself, how many times have you done this to someone who didn't have the rank to put you in a room and ask you about it?" The question sat in the room between them like something with weight. She said, "Not just in corridors. How many rooms? How many decisions about who you make space for and who you don't? How many times has the system in your head been running without you noticing it running?" Rourke was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't have a good answer to that, ma'am." She said, "I know you don't. That's the point." She looked down at the folder in front of her. The meeting, it appeared, was concluding, not with a dramatic gesture, but with the administrative efficiency of someone who has more things to do today than this one thing, and has given this one thing exactly the time it was worth. No more, no less. She said, "There will be a formal notation. You'll meet with your CO. What happens next is between you and the Corps and whatever you decide to do with the question I just gave you." She said, dismissed. He stood. He was going to say something else. You could see it in the way he held himself at the door, the way his body was still working something out, and then he did not say it. He nodded once, the note of a man who has just received something he did not expect and does not yet know what to do with, and he walked out. The door closed. The two men who had been furniture looked up. She was already reading the next item in her folder. The formal notation went into Rourke's record 3 days later. It did not end his career. It was not designed to end his career. It was designed in the precise and functional way of a system that works best when it works on the specific level rather than the theatrical one. To be in his file when his next fitness report was written by a commanding officer who would now know the thing that had happened in the corridor and would know the way it had been handled and would weigh it. This is the part of these stories that does not get told very often because it is not a satisfying part. There was no viral moment. There was no photograph. There was no clip being shared across platforms with a score that told you how to feel. It was a folder notation and a closed door and a question that a man carried back to his unit inside him. But Christine did not need a viral moment. She had learned a long time ago that the most durable things are the ones that do not require an audience. What the corridor had taken from her was 30 seconds and the pages of a folder. What it had cost her was something harder to quantify. The particular low-grade tax that is collected again and again from people who move through spaces where they are not expected, the toll that does not appear on any formal record but accumulates in the body over years and decades in ways that doctors can measure if you ask them to look. She did not spend a lot of time thinking about the toll. She had tried, early in her career, to keep a kind of mental ledger, not of grievances, but of incidents, because incidents were data, and data told you something about the system, and understanding the system was the precondition of operating effectively inside it. She had stopped keeping the ledger somewhere around year 12 because the ledger had become too large, and the keeping of it had started to feel like a second job. She kept the file. She dropped the ledger. The distinction matters. The file was professional, a record of events that were relevant to how she did her work and how she protected the people she was responsible for. The ledger was personal, and the personal version had a way of sitting in your chest in a manner that was not productive, that produced heat without generating useful energy, that cost more than it revealed. She was not a saint about this. She was not someone who had transcended the normal human responses to being chronically underestimated and sometimes actively obstructed. She had done the thing most people who survive long careers in difficult systems eventually do. She had found a place to put it that was not her body and not her work, and she had put it there, and she had closed the drawer, and she had gone to the next thing. The next thing, on the afternoon of the corridor, was a video briefing with 3 people in 2 different time zones about an operation she cannot name. After that, a one-on-one with a junior officer she had been mentoring for 8 months who had just received a posting recommendation and needed someone to tell her what to do with the next 6 months before everything changed. After that, a dinner she attended alone at a restaurant 2 miles from the base where she ate a bowl of soup and read 60 pages of a novel she had been working through for 3 weeks. She slept well. This is not a detail included to suggest that she was unaffected. She was affected. She was affected the way anyone is affected by a thing that confirms what they already know about the world. Not shattered, not destabilized, but touched in a specific place where you keep the knowledge that the world is the way the world is, and that knowledge is heavy even when it is familiar. She was affected in the way that 26 years of the same particular kind of weight affects a person. Not in the dramatic, visible way that makes for a clean narrative, but in the incremental, structural way that builds into something that does not have an easy name. She slept well. She had developed over time the ability to put things in their correct spatial and temporal location, to know the difference between the thing that required her attention tonight and the thing that required her attention in the structural, ongoing sense, and to give each thing its appropriate slot. The corridor was in a slot. The question she had put into Rourke was in a different slot. The folder notation was in a third slot. The soup was just soup. The novel was just a novel. In the morning, there would be 3 briefings, 2 decisions, and a video call with Washington. She had prepared for all 3 briefings the previous week. The 2 decisions were not difficult. They were the kind of decisions that appear difficult from the outside because of the weight of their consequences, but that are actually, when you have spent long enough building the judgment to make them, simply the application of a clear process to a specific set of facts. The call with Washington was the interesting one, but that too was in its correct slot. She turned out the light. In a barracks 2 miles away, Sergeant First Class Daniel Rourke was awake. He would later say, in a conversation that would take place months after this night, in a context that neither he nor Christine would have predicted, that he did not sleep at all, that he lay in his rack in the dark and ran the question she had given him, and that running, it was like trying to count something that kept changing shape. Every time he thought he had the number, the category shifted. How many times? In how many rooms? He did not have the answer. He had understood, sitting in that office, that the point was not to have the answer. The point was to have the question, and to carry it in the place where you carry things that matter before you know what to do with them. In this way, in a very small, unsexy, undramatic way that most real change begins, something had started. Not a story, not yet a story. A question, moving through the dark. The story got out. This was not Christine's doing. She had not told anyone outside the formal chain that handled the notation. She had not called a friend and recounted it over coffee. She had not put it in an email with a forwarded attachment and a subject line that said, "You're not going to believe this." She had filed the appropriate report, made the appropriate call, and gone back to her afternoon. But a corridor is not a sealed room. A corridor has witnesses, and witnesses have phones, and phones exist in a world where the gap between seeing something and describing it to 11 other people is approximately 45 seconds. The ensign who had taken a half step forward and then stopped. Her name was Martinez. Ensign Second Class Sophia Martinez, 23 years old, 8 months in her first posting, had told exactly one person. She had told her roommate. Her roommate had told 2 people. By the end of the first day, the story was moving through the base in the compressed, telegraph speed way that military gossip moves, which is faster than civilian gossip because the community is smaller and the walls between professional and social life are more porous than the institution admits. By the end of the second day, the story had acquired details it had not had originally. In some versions, Rourke had knocked Christine to the ground. In some versions, she had spoken to him in the corridor directly, with the kind of devastating composure that would require a film score to be adequately appreciated. In one version, the version that appeared briefly on a private Facebook group for military spouses before being taken down, she had looked at him after the collision and said very quietly, "You have no idea who I am," and then walked away. She had not said this. The corridor had been silent except for the sound of her folder hitting the floor and the sound of Rourke's boots continuing to move. But the invented version was doing what invented versions always do. It was performing something true that the accurate version had been too quiet to perform. People were sharing the invented version because it did the work that the actual event, a woman picking up her papers and continuing to her meeting, did not do loudly enough for a world trained to require its justice to be visible. Christine became aware of the story circulating on the 4th day when a junior officer on her staff named Lieutenant Commander Webb, Marcus Webb, 34, the kind of person who monitors the temperature of a room the way other people monitor stock prices, came in her office with the specific expression of someone about to say a thing they would rather not have to say. He said, "Admiral, there's a version of the corridor incident moving around on social." She said, "What version?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "How far has it gone?" He said, "Still contained to military networks mostly. But there are a few shares outside." She said, "All right." He said, "Do you want me to?" She said, "No." He said, "The version with the quote isn't accurate." She said, "I know it's not accurate." A pause. "It doesn't matter." He looked at her with the expression of a man who finds this answer insufficient and has the good sense not to say so. She said, "What matters is the thing the inaccuracy is pointing at. The quote isn't real. The thing that made someone invent the quote is real. Those are different problems, and I'm only responsible for one of them." Webb went back to his desk. He would think about what she had said for a long time after this, would bring it up in conversations years later as an example of the way she parsed problems, the way she separated the signal from the noise without dismissing the noise, which was its own skill that looked like coldness from the outside, but was actually something more like surgical precision. The story, accurate and inaccurate versions both, eventually reached a reporter. Her name was Dana Cho. She was a defense correspondent for a publication that covered military affairs with the specific combination of rigor and frustration that tends to characterize people who spend their careers trying to get institutions to acknowledge things the institutions have a structural interest in not acknowledging. She was 37. She had been covering the military for 11 years. She had sources on multiple bases and an inbox full of stories that she could not yet publish because the sources were not ready to be named and the documentation was not yet sufficient and the moment had not yet arrived. She had heard about the corridor story on the 5th day. By the 6th day, she had confirmed, through 2 independent sources, that the broad shape of it was accurate. A senior female officer in civilian clothes, a physical encounter with a junior enlisted Marine, a formal notation. By the 7th day, she had the names. She called Christine's office. Christine took the call. She said, "I don't have a comment on the specific incident beyond what's in the formal record." Cho said, "I understand that. I'm actually more interested in the broader context." Christine said, "What context specifically?" Cho said, "The pattern. Women officers in civilian clothes. Unrecognized in corridors, in parking lots, in meeting rooms. Treated as staff or visitors until their rank becomes visible. I've heard this story in a lot of forms." Christine was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "That's a story that exists." Cho said, "Would you talk to me about off the record?" Christine said no. Cho said, "Would you talk to me about your career generally?" Christine said, "That would require me to think about whether there's a useful reason for me to do that." Cho said, "I think there is." Christine said, "I'll get back to you." She sat with the question for 3 days. She talked to no one about it, which was her method. She was not a person who processed decisions out loud, who needed the friction of another person's perspective to arrive at her own. She processed internally, which made her seem self-contained and occasionally alarming to people who mistook self-containment for the absence of inner life. What she was actually doing during those 3 days was running a calculation that had nothing to do with personal visibility and everything to do with the structural question that Cho had named without naming. Who gets seen? Because the corridor was one incident. And she had known for 26 years, had filed the knowledge in the place where you file things that are true and actionable, and whose time has not yet arrived, that the corridor was not the problem. The corridor was a symptom. The corridor was what happens downstream of a training environment that has spent decades producing a very specific and very detailed picture of what authority looks like. And that picture does not, in its default rendering, include a woman in civilian clothes carrying a folder and a cup of coffee. She called Cho back on the 4th day. She said, "I'll talk to you, on the record, about my career in general terms. The incident is not the story I'm interested in." Cho said, "What story are you interested in?" Christine said, "The one about what you build and who you build it for and whether the structure knows the difference." The interview was published 6 weeks later. It ran long, 4,000 words, which was longer than Cho's editor had initially approved, but which the editor had agreed to after reading the draft, because the draft was the kind of thing that does not compress without losing what makes it worth reading. It was careful. It did not name the corridor incident except in a single oblique paragraph that established context without dwelling on it. It was mostly Christine talking about her career in the abstract, middle-distance language of someone who is choosing, with great precision, exactly what to illuminate and what to leave in the shadow where it still had work to do. But there were moments in the interview where she said things directly. She said, "The question I've been asked most often in my career is some version of how did you do it? What they mean is, how did you stay? How did you survive a system that wasn't designed with you in mind?" And my answer has always been the same. I decided that the most powerful thing I could do was stay more interested in the mission than in my own comfort. The mission was the anchor. Everything else was weather. She said, "The mistake people make when they think about this is they imagine it as a battle. They imagine the woman fighting her way through a wall of resistance. That's not what it is. What it is much quieter and much longer. It's 26 years of being in the room. Just being in the room. Until the room adjusts." She said, "The room always adjusts. It takes longer than it should, but it adjusts." The interview was shared widely, not virally, not in the way that produces a moment and then dissolves, but in the steady, lasting way of things that people print out and put on bulletin boards and send to their daughters and keep in a folder of things they return to when they need to remember that endurance is not the same as defeat. Christine read the coverage. She did not enjoy the coverage in the way people expected her to enjoy it, because the coverage was partly about a thing she had spent 26 years declining to perform. But she understood what it was doing, understood that the story of the corridor, told accurately and in full context, was doing something that the incident itself had not been able to do alone. It was making visible a structure that was most powerful when it was invisible. She put the interview in her files. She went to her next briefing. 3 weeks after the interview published, she received a letter, not an email. A physical letter, handwritten, mailed through the official military postal system to her office address. It was from Rourke. The letter was 2 pages long. She has not disclosed its contents in detail, and this account will not invent them, because invented details are the enemy of the actual thing, and the actual thing, in this case, is already sufficient. What she has said about the letter, in one subsequent conversation that has been documented, is that it was honest in a way that surprised her, and that honest surprises in this specific category had become rare enough that she noticed them. She wrote back. Her letter was shorter. 1 page. She has not disclosed its contents either, and they belong to her. She has said, in the same conversation, what I wanted him to understand was that what happened in the corridor was not the most important thing. It was not the story I was going to carry. The most important thing, the thing I wanted him to think about, was the question. Did he ask it? Did he sit with it long enough for it to actually do something? She said, I don't know if he did. I hope he did. That's the honest answer. I hope he did. In the weeks after the corridor, Ensign Sofia Martinez had also been having a conversation that she had not expected to be having. It began with her roommate, who had asked her, after the story started spreading, why she hadn't done anything in the hallway when she saw it happen. Martinez had been thinking about this already. She had been thinking about it since the moment she took the half step forward and then stopped, caught in the paralysis she had not been able to name in the moment, but that she had been naming ever since. She knew what it was now. She had been calculating, in that half second, the cost of intervening, not the cost to Christine. Christine had not needed her intervention, had not needed anyone's intervention, was already bending down to collect her folder before Martinez had finished her half step. But the cost of Martinez herself. The cost of being a 23-year-old ensign 8 months into her first posting who steps into a situation involving a Marine NCO, and whatever the woman he collided with actually was. She had calculated the cost, and the cost had been high enough that her feet had stopped. And she had been thinking about that calculation ever since. Not with guilt. She was not the kind of person who weaponized guilt against herself, or had decided not to be, which amounted to the same thing in practice, but with the specific curiosity of someone who wants to understand a decision she made so that she can make better decisions going forward. She had, in the weeks after the corridor, started asking questions. Not loudly, not in any way that would have shown up on an official record, but in the incremental, conversational way that junior officers acquire knowledge. In the breaks between briefings, over dinner, in the corridors themselves, she had been asking people about the woman in the civilian clothes, and about the systems that produced the corridor, and about what it meant to be the person who calculated the cost, and decided it was too high. She did not get clean answers. Clean answers were not available, because the questions she was asking were questions that the institution had not officially decided it needed to answer yet. But she got partial answers, and partial answers from many different people across many different conversations eventually accumulate into something more useful than a clean answer from a single source. Because what they accumulate into is a picture of a system, its shape, its pressures, its places where the structure is thinner than it looks from outside. Martinez was 23. She had 26 years of her own career ahead of her. She was in the way that beginnings are quiet and slow and look like nothing from the outside, beginning to build something, a set of tools for understanding how rooms work and who they are built for and what it costs to be a person who is not the default assumption. She did not know yet where those tools would take her. She was in the hallway where it had started, collecting them. And in her office, Rear Admiral Christine Engel was on a secure line about an operation she cannot name, making decisions that will not appear in any public record, exercising an authority that no corridor encounter, and no coverage cycle, and no letter in the mail had given her, and that none of those things could take away. She had built that authority across 26 years. She had built it in rooms where she was not expected, in systems that had to be persuaded by the evidence of her own performance, in the accumulated weight of decisions made correctly under pressure in conditions that were not designed with her in mind. It was hers. It had always been hers. The room had just taken a long time to finish adjusting.